It was a calm, sunny morning in our suburban neighborhood, the kind of day where nothing dramatic seemed possible. My family and I were enjoying breakfast, oblivious to the chaos that was about to unfold. The atmosphere was peaceful, with birds chirping and neighbors jogging by. But then, a knock at the door changed everything. It was a member of the HOA, Homeowners Association, someone I'd only seen in passing before. They carried an air of authority that immediately set the tone for what was to come. Their demeanor wasn't friendly, it was confrontational. The HOA member began to rant about alleged violations we had committed, pointing fingers at minor things like the length of our grass and the placement of a flower pot. At first, it seemed absurd, almost laughable, but the intensity of their tone suggested they were serious. My wife and I exchanged confused glances as the accusations escalated. "If you don't comply," the HOA member barked, "there will be consequences." It was more than a warning, it was a threat. Little did we know, this encounter was just the beginning of a nightmare. The HOA member seemed determined to make an example out of us, their obsession growing more irrational by the day. That evening, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. My kids, unaware of the growing tension, played outside while I kept glancing over my shoulder. Something told me this wasn't over. Looking back, it's strange how one small interaction can spiral into something much bigger. That day marked the start of a journey that would test our patience, courage, and faith in the system. The HOA member, let's call him Mr. Reynolds, had always been a figure of mild annoyance in our community. Known for patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard and a stern expression, he seemed to take his role far too seriously. At first, most of us thought of him as harmless, a stickler for rules perhaps, but nothing more. However, as time passed, stories began to circulate about his aggressive behavior. Rumors suggested he had targeted other families before us, demanding compliance with obscure regulations. His background was somewhat mysterious. He didn't interact with neighbors outside of his official duties, and his house was always immaculate, almost to a fault. Some speculated that his obsession with control stemmed from something personal, but no one knew for sure. What became clear was that Mr. Reynolds viewed himself as the ultimate authority in the neighborhood. He wielded his position in the HOA like a badge of honor, often ignoring the opinions of other members. As I dug deeper, I found out that his complaints against us weren't unique. Other neighbors had received similar visits, though they had chosen to back down rather than confront him. It seemed like Mr. Reynolds thrived on intimidation. What puzzled me most was his fixation on our family. While we weren't perfect, we had always followed the basic rules. Yet his grievances grew more absurd by the day. He even began scrutinizing how long our kids played outside, as if it were a violation of some unwritten code. The more I learned about Mr. Reynolds, the more I realized we were dealing with someone who wouldn't stop until he had his way. And that realization left me with a chilling question. How far was he willing to go? At first, the threats were subtle. A pointed remark during one of his visits, a note left in our mailbox with vague warnings. We brushed it off, assuming it was just Mr. Reynolds being his usual overbearing self. But then the notes became more frequent and direct. One evening, I found a letter taped to our front door, demanding that we remove a tree in our yard. The letter cited a rule that didn't even exist in the HOA guidelines. It was clear he was making things up to exert control. I confronted him the next day, but he brushed me off with a smug grin. "I'm just enforcing the rules," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. When I pointed out the lack of legitimacy, his smile faded, replaced by a stern warning. "You don't want to make this personal." That was the moment I realized this was more than just an overzealous HOA member. His actions felt targeted, almost like he was looking for an excuse to escalate the situation. The breaking point came when he started involving other members of the HOA. Suddenly, I was receiving notices from the association for violations I'd never committed. It felt like a coordinated attack, with Mr. Reynolds pulling the strings. What started as annoyance turned into dread. I began to wonder if he was watching us, waiting for any excuse to strike. My wife suggested installing security cameras, a precaution that would soon prove invaluable. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. The threats began to feel personal, aimed not at compliance, but at breaking our resolve. When the police arrived, Mr. Reynolds had already left the property, but I showed them the footage from my security camera. The officer was polite but hesitant. "It's a civil matter," they said. "You should file a report with the HOA." Frustrated but determined, I decided to confront the HOA board. To my shock, they were dismissive of my complaint. Some even sided with Mr. Reynolds, claiming he was within his rights as a representative of the HOA to inspect properties. This blatant disregard for boundaries left me feeling powerless. It wasn't just about trespassing anymore. It was about the lack of accountability. If no one in authority was willing to stand up to him, what else could he get away with? The situation escalated when I noticed damage to my property after his late-night visit. A section of my fence was broken, and a few of my plants were trampled. There was no doubt in my mind who was responsible, but proving it was another story. My kids were scared. They didn't understand why someone would target us, and I struggled to reassure them when I wasn't sure myself. My wife, usually calm and composed, began insisting that we consider moving away. But I couldn't let him win. This wasn't just about our family anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thought he was above the law. The next step was clear. I had to gather evidence and prepare for a fight, not just for us, but for anyone else who might be in his sights. The safety of my family became my top priority. I installed more cameras, reinforced our locks, and even considered hiring private security. It felt extreme, but the growing sense of danger left me with no choice. My wife and I had long conversations about what to do next. Should we move? Should we stay and fight? Every option seemed risky, but the idea of uprooting our lives because of one man's obsession didn't sit right with me. The emotional toll was immense. My kids stopped playing outside, too afraid of what might happen. My wife avoided going out alone, and I found myself losing sleep, watching the security feeds late into the night. One evening, as we were discussing our options, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't Mr. Reynolds, it was another neighbor. They had heard about our situation and wanted to offer their support. Hearing their words gave me a glimmer of hope. We weren't alone in this fight, and others in the neighborhood were just as frustrated with Mr. Reynolds' behavior. Together, we began organizing. I compiled every piece of evidence I had: video footage, photographs, and written accounts of his threats. Our goal was to present a united front to the HOA and, if necessary, take legal action. But there was a deeper fear lingering in the back of my mind. What if this pushed him further? Would he retaliate? Protecting my family meant preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The day I confronted Mr. Reynolds directly was one I'll never forget. It wasn't planned. Our paths crossed unexpectedly at a community meeting. The tension in the air was palpable, and I knew this was my chance to address him in front of others. "Why are you targeting my family?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. Reynolds smirked, clearly unbothered by the attention. "I'm enforcing the rules," he replied dismissively, as though his actions were justified. But I wasn't about to let him brush me off this time. I laid out the evidence: the false complaints, the trespassing, and the threats. The room grew quiet as I played the security footage of him prowling around my yard. The shocked expressions on my neighbors' faces said it all. Reynolds tried to defend himself, claiming he was just doing his job, but his excuses fell flat. The truth was out, and it was clear to everyone that his behavior had crossed a line. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me, expressing their support. Some admitted they had been too afraid to stand up to him before. Knowing I wasn't alone in this fight gave me the strength to keep going. The confrontation marked a turning point. While Reynolds still held his position of power in the HOA, his influence began to wane. People started questioning his motives and challenging his authority. Despite this small victory, I knew the battle wasn't over. Reynolds wasn't the type to back down easily, and I had to stay vigilant. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The decision to involve law enforcement wasn't an easy one. Part of me feared it would escalate the situation further, but the safety of my family was my top priority. I handed over all the evidence to the police: footage of Reynolds trespassing, the threatening notes, and testimonies from other neighbors. The officer I spoke to took the matter seriously, assuring me that they would investigate. However, filing a police report didn't bring the immediate relief I had hoped for. Reynolds seemed unfazed by the involvement of law enforcement. In fact, his behavior became even more brazen, as though he was daring me to do something about it. One night, a patrol car passed by our house, and I felt a fleeting sense of security. But the reality was that the police couldn't be there 24/7. I was still left wondering when and where Reynolds might strike next. Despite the fear, I found comfort in knowing I had taken action. The police presence, though limited, sent a clear message. I wasn't going to tolerate his behavior any longer. The situation also brought the community closer together. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to speak out, sharing their own encounters with Reynolds. Together, we started to push back against his reign of intimidation. The involvement of the police shifted the dynamic. For the first time, Reynolds seemed to realize that he wasn't invincible. But his resistance only fueled my determination to see this through. The morning of his arrest was surreal. It began like any other day, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. I was on edge, knowing the police had finally gathered enough evidence to act. When the patrol cars pulled up outside Reynolds' house, I watched from my window, heart pounding. Officers knocked on his door, and after what felt like an eternity, he emerged, looking both furious and defiant. The sight of him being handcuffed and led away was a mix of relief and disbelief. It wasn't just about vindication. It was about knowing my family could finally feel safe again. News of the arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood. While some were shocked, most saw it as a long-overdue consequence for his actions. For me, it was the culmination of weeks of stress, fear, and determination. Reynolds faced charges for trespassing and harassment, and while the legal process would take time, the immediate impact was undeniable. The community began to heal, and a sense of normalcy returned to our lives. That night, as I tucked my kids in a bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. The arrest didn't just bring relief to my family. It sparked a wave of change throughout the community. Neighbors who had once been passive began to take a more active role in the HOA, ensuring that power was distributed more fairly. Reynolds' absence left a noticeable void, but it was one that allowed for positive growth. New leaders emerged, focused on collaboration rather than control. The HOA became less about enforcement and more about fostering a sense of community. For weeks, neighbors approached me, sharing stories of how Reynolds had targeted them in the past. Many expressed regret for not standing up to him sooner, but their support now made all the difference. My family and I were no longer seen as victims. We were viewed as the catalyst for change. It was a humbling experience, knowing that our struggle had made the neighborhood a better place for everyone. Looking back, the experience taught me lessons I'll carry for the rest of my life. The first and most important: never ignore your instincts. When something feels wrong, it probably is. Second, don't underestimate the power of community. Alone, I might not have been able to stand up to Reynolds, but together, we created a force he couldn't ignore. Lastly, always document everything. The evidence I gathered was crucial in holding Reynolds accountable. Without it, his behavior might have continued unchecked. While I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, I'm grateful for the lessons it taught me. My family emerged stronger, and our neighborhood is now a place we can truly call home.